So, as I was chatting about just before we started recording, I went back and listened to our interview, which was just a few years ago when we had you on. And it was really interesting to see how we were almost ahead of the time and talking about topics that are now mainstream. It actually made me feel a bit limited about today's episode because I went, oh, we already talked about all these like big things before they were big, but we'll have to revisit them. And some of the things we talked about was how odd it was that people were focused on the permanent resident target and almost no one was talking about temporary residency. That completely changed in 2023. You raised how schools weren't treated different in terms of economic immigration. That obviously blew up in 2023, leading to the caps in 2024. And we talked about how whether it made sense to have Francophone immigration targets as part of express entry, and you even used I hope I pronounced this right, the Jan Tinderbergen
Mm,
theory about how every policy objective needs to have a specific policy instrument. I love things like that, little names for different theories. So if you have any of those, definitely use them again.
mm.
So all of those have now come to the mainstream. It'll be interesting to see if we talk about things that 2 years ago or 2 years from now are hugely talked about. The other thing that I think shifted was you were one of the few academics back then who was expressing concerns, at least publicly, over immigration. That has also shifted. And I think we have to start with probably the question now that is getting asked in the media a lot. And it's probably the broad question that I'm sure you get asked and hate getting asked, but I have to ask it. Is immigration hurting Canada's economy? In 2023, the record, and now a continuing record population growth,
Mm.
is that hurting Canada's economy? And
Yeah,
indirectly, is that driving up housing prices, putting strain on services? These are all things now that are constantly in the news, questions being asked. I get asked, even after, I remember like last year I won this really complicated case for someone, for a consultant's client where we did a judicial review. And after they joked, well, where are they going to live and work? And it's just been this shift in the tone. So do you get asked this? Yeah, whether immigration now is
sure,
hurting Canada's economy?
sure. And I always disappoint with my answer because I don't have one.
Yeah,
Um, the answer to that question requires that the person answering the question, asking the question, also define what they mean by a good economy. What is the objective? Economies are complicated, and in particular because there are many players,
yeah.
beneficiaries. There are lots of costs and benefits experienced very differently among millions of people within the economy. And so the reality is that if nothing else, immigration has distributional effects, which means that the effects of immigration aren't felt the same by everyone in the population. And so, just as an example, I don't think there's much doubt in my mind that the surge in population growth that we've seen in the past couple of years has had an impact on housing prices within local housing markets, where those population increases have been experienced the most. Um, there's also little doubt in my mind that a lot of those housing pressures would have been felt independently of immigration. There's other factors at play here, but it certainly is exacerbated in some markets.
Can we pause on that? Because when I say that to some immigration lawyers, they'll say, oh, well, we need a study. Or, oh, well, people thought the same, like people blamed foreign buyers and that the legislation to stop that didn't impact things. And to me, it seems as simple as supply and demand, which I wouldn't think needs a study. But is it just that simple as supply and demand?
Well, it's a little bit, it is a supply and demand model, but it's a particular supply and demand model. So for those who have done Econ 101, which I teach about 800 students every fall, I actually use this as an example. It's the demand and supply model, the picture, in which the supply curve is very vertical. It's very inelastic, we say. What does that
Yeah.
mean? That means when the price of housing changes, in particular when the price goes up, we don't get much of an increase in the supply, at least in the short run. The supply adjusts sluggishly. And a huge factor for that in Canada in particular is all the regulation that happens. Developers have a hard time. They want to build more housing because there's more money to be made because the prices have gone up. But getting over those regulations, those hurdles is tough. There's a lot of red tape, as we say. So that creates an inelastic supply curve. So if you have a market, housing, any market with an inelastic supply curve, and then you increase demand, what's going to happen? Well, most of the action here is going to happen on this price and not on the quantity, right?
Yeah.
The price is going to get driven up, but you're not going to get much change. You get some because the supply curve is not perfectly inelastic. You get some more housing, but mostly it's going to just push prices up because there are more and more people competing for the same amount of housing. And, in terms of the empirical evidence, there is absolutely empirical evidence of this. Like, there is clear evidence from many countries that when you increase the population very quickly and you hold the housing supply constant, that it raises prices. Okay, so there's no question that happened. But okay, so coming back to the original question, is that good or bad, increased housing prices? Well, that depends on what side of the market I'm on. If I'm a buyer in the market, not so good. If I'm a seller in the market, I'm rubbing my hands. So, that ultimately is the effect of immigration. Like, if you want me to summarize the effect of immigration on the economy, is like, for the most part, in the aggregate, it's pretty neutral. It doesn't do a whole, if it isn't too big, it doesn't do much to GDP per capita. Average wages, average things don't change a whole hell of a lot. Economies are pretty robust. They can absorb newcomers. Absolutely. But there are these distributional effects, and those distributional effects depend a lot on the composition, especially the skill composition of the immigration. And that's where I get worried, right? My worry has never been so much about the levels. Like the levels, the targets on the permanent side have never really concerned me that much. That's not where the reason I became more engaged in this issue was not about those levels targets. It's about a shift in the composition, who we're targeting, and it's and what's happening on the temporary side, I think, concerns me more.
On the temporary side is 2 to 2.5 times it's interesting because they don't track, there's a lot they don't track when they report on temporary, but it's about 2 to 2.5 that permanent side. So, and we talked about GDP and GDP per capita last time, and one of the, I don't want to say conspiracy theories, but something that you hear that immigration is all that's propping up Canada's GDP, and then there's the counter people saying, well, GDP per capita is falling. Is that true that GDP per capita right now is falling and has been falling, and that its GDP growth is kind of not, the average Canadian doesn't feel GDP growth as much as they feel GDP per capita falling?
I think
and then you hear people now that
right.
It's falling, it's like the first time, I grew up where everybody talked about GDP per capita, and now that it's falling, there's some reports where it's like, well, maybe we've been measuring the wrong thing. So it's, and I always just assume that's politics, but like, is that the case right now? And there were press releases where IRC would say, we're increasing temporary immigration to increase the economy. But what that distinction between, do you find there would be, well, actually, so recessions are measured in GDP or GDP per capita?
In the level of GDP, total GDP, when that for 2 consecutive quarters is negative, so the overall level has decreased for 2 consecutive quarters, then that's the typical definition of a recession. Of course, these things aren't really that meaningful. Nothing magical happens when it's 2 quarters or just 1 quarter. Yeah, there's no magical numbers.
Is there a term for declining GDP per capita?
No. So, I mean, I have been known to refer to this as a GDP per capita recession, but that's a little silly. I mean, even the term, thinking of a recession as some binary thing, either you're in a recession or not, is of course silly. This is a continuum, a spectrum of how well the economy is doing. Yeah.
And this is something we didn't talk about last time because it wasn't in the cards, is this year Canada, in their report to Parliament on immigration, is going to track temporary numbers or include goals for temporary numbers. I don't fully know how that will work on the worker side. On the student side, it's been done through caps.
Mhm.
Um, is there, what generally happens when population growth goes from rapid to leveling off? I mean, I doubt the population will decline, but if it goes from rapidly growing to growing less, does that have economic consequences generally?
So, um, just as like the background, I think we've done a little bit of math. I think given the new target for the NPR population share of the total population, which is like 6.5% now, they're targeting in 3 years to get it down to 5%. That implies a substantial decrease in overall population growth in Canada over the next 3 years. If they're really going to do this,
Yeah.
they need to reduce overall population growth from a little over 3%, which has just been phenomenal. Like that's just unheard of anywhere in the OECD to have population growth rates at that level, down to what it was before they started to ratchet this up in 2015. So point for from for 15 years from 2015 from 2000 to 2015, we kept population growth about 0.8% of the population. That's basically where they got to get back to. So they're returning to sort of the pre-Trudeau, the numbers. What does that do to the economy? Well, for sure, in terms of the total size of the economy and the growth and the overall size of the economy, the GDP level, that's going to tend to reduce that.
Hmm.
You add fewer people to the population every year, it's going to grow less because everybody that we add to the population, for the most part, contributes something to growing the overall size of the pie. And so the pie is just not going to be growing as fast. What happens to GDP per capita? That depends an awful lot on the composition. And the easiest way to think about this is like, what are the earnings of the marginal people that you're adding to the population? If those marginal people being added to the population are above the average, it pulls the average up, and if they're below the average, it pulls the average down. That's the what you might call the compositional effect of immigration. That's kind of the first order effect of immigration. There are more complicated general equilibrium effects where the immigrants are sort of affecting earnings of people that are already here in various ways. Those are harder to think about. But the first order effect, and I think why GDP per capita, for the most part, is falling now, is because we've added a whole bunch of people to the economy whose contributions measured most usefully through their earnings are below the average, and that's pulling the overall average down.
Two directions to go from there. Do you think they'll achieve this through reducing temporary number or increasing permanent?
That's a
Right? Like
great
that's the other way.
question,
You just
Mark.
increase the
Steve.
denominator.
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah. How
Example
do
A
you
would
do
be,
this?
and I had seen that you'd tweeted about this, would be the caregiver program is now just a straight to PR program where Deanna's not on, so I can say this, where it's essentially just almost I'd be surprised. Well, we'll see how many actually work as caregivers or what that program will be after this. But like, that's one way to achieve it is just increasing permanent residence numbers.
Above the existing targets, but those are 3 years out, right? So I don't see them doing that.
Yeah, I don't know.
They've leveled, in the most recent levels plan on the PR side. I think it was the only number I was looking at when they announced it was the 26 number, the new number, and whether that was going to continue to go up. The fact that they leveled that off, stabilized it at 500,000, I think that spoke volumes about
Yeah,
how.
I mean they've kind of set themselves up in a situation where if they stick to those PR targets, they're going to have massive backlogs or they'll have to jack it in 2027. Like those
That's it.
numbers, there's 300,000 Ukrainians here
Yeah.
with an H&C target of 10,000 per year, right? Like that's unless they jack those targets up, or if they got to find, and they're going to figure
Yep.
out a way to, they will figure out a way, I'm sure, to take them. And there's talk of a program for people without status that could be up to 500,000. So
But
I
those
don't
are all up
know.
against the PR target, right? So
Yeah, I don't know what
I
they're gonna do.
they're between a
Um,
rock and a hard place. They really are. This is the
yeah,
crux. There's a bulge. The whole point is we've moved towards this two-step immigration system. And increasingly migrants are coming here taking up temporary visas, whether work permits or study permits, under the expectation that they're going to transition to PR. They're being, sold academic placements and paying massive tuition fees under the expectation that they will make that. That's not, the fault of migrants. That's complete. Like they're completely within
yeah,
their rights to have that expectation. But what's happened is it just completely became out of control. It was a runaway train, as I described it, and that it's created this massive bulge in which there's no clear way to transition enough people given the cap on PRs. And what it means for the most part, what I imagine will be happening is that the percent of new PRs that are coming directly from abroad without any temporary permit in Canada, the kind of one-step migration, if you want, like, that's going to go close to zero. That has always been a pretty small, like less than
yeah,
half of all new PRs have been, from the temporary pool. But I think we're going to see, I don't see it. And that has consequences. I'm not thrilled about that. I think that has consequences doing that because the skill composition within the MPR pool right now is not strong. And so you're lowering standards on skill. And I worry about what message that sends to, prospective migrants from abroad, that we have all these ad hoc programs now. As I describe it, it's the way we select from the MPR pool looks more and more like a lottery. And I worry about how that lures migrants here in the future.
yeah. So this was something, and this goes back. I have to look up the name that because they keep calling it the Jan
Yeah,
Tinderbergen.
Tinbergen rule.
Tinbergen. I keep calling it
Yeah.
when I'm trying to remember it since our talk, the Tinder, like just so for every policy object, like right now in Express Entry, since we last spoke, and again, you talked like the importance of wages as measuring at least GDP per capita. Now within there, they've got all these categories of, they've identified, I think you spoke as well that the government trying to target labor shortages at a time through permanent residence isn't really a way to solve these labor shortages to the extent that they exist. But now they've got healthcare, construction, agriculture, and then the big one, which is 30%, is francophones. And every time there's a draw for francophones, the press release will say, quote, supporting economic growth through francophone migration, end quote. Is there anything Are there any studies that suggests that Francophone migration particularly supports economic growth? Bearing in mind, Francophone migration is for people who aren't going to Quebec.
The lens that you have to look through this through, because of course it gets very political, but ultimately the question you have to ask yourself is, it is a zero-sum policy choice.
Yeah.
Every time I prioritize, because of the PR cap, right? There's only a certain number of slots and we have to decide how to allocate them. So every time I allocate it to one group, prioritize one group or set of attributes of the applicant over something else, there's a trade-off there. There's an opportunity cost, as economists call it. And, I've been studying earnings of, not in particular immigrants, for about 20 years, but also looking at the relative earnings of Canadian immigrants compared to like domestic workers. Without question, university educated migrants, especially those from the top universities, do exceptionally well. They do really well. They have earnings that are off the charts. So that's the trade-off. If you really, really want to, select migrants with high earnings, they're going to raise GDP per capita, raise productivity growth. You want what we call high human capital candidates. Those are essentially the STEM graduates from the country's top universities. And those folks, I'm talking to them at University of Waterloo, are getting shut out of the system now, are getting frustrated and going elsewhere. Because what's happened is with these category-based selections, including the French, what's happening is the pool of top CRS scores is the number of people with very high CR scores is increasing because they're just not being selected anymore in the way they were on a regular basis before. And so the CRS cutoffs for those general draws are going well above 500. And
Yep.
a lot of these undergraduate computer science students from Toronto, University of Toronto, UBC, McGill, Waterloo are not getting selected. Let me just tell you one thing. Stephen, I haven't talked to a lot of people about this, but just like for your listeners that might be interested in this, like I'm going to plug some of my own work here, but I'm super excited about it. So what I don't think I mentioned this in the last time I was on your show. What I took me like 6 years to do this, like way before the pandemic, I started to try and push the government to allow me to take, first I had to get my university to agree to do it, but they gave me all the data on every graduate at the University of Waterloo since 2005 with all their grades and all their courses. So using grades, I can measure kind of their skills, and not just on one dimension, but on different dimensions, because like every math student has to take English communication scores. So I can see how strong their English skills. I can see how good their math skills are. I can see how good their programming skills are. So I got multi-dimensional measures of their skill. I convinced the government to let me link that to all their immigration records, their temporary
Oh,
and
wow.
permanent. So, and the match rate was like phenomenal. Like we're all pretty much matching everybody, and all their T1 income tax returns. So we see all their earnings. I hope by the end of July I'm going to have the results out. But as kind of like a teaser here, let me assure you, if you look at graduates from the STEM programs at the University of Waterloo, international students, they're off the charts. Their earnings are higher than the average Canadian-born earnings at the University of Waterloo. The international students are outperforming the Canadian-born students. They're stars. And the smartest among them, we can see, are not settling in Canada. We don't see PR. Actually, no, that's not quite right. That's the domestic. The smartest ones are. It flatlines, but anyways, we are attracting the smartest one. And the PR transition rate is about 70%. That's twice the national average. Very high numbers. So that's the trade. Like that's my bias. I'm working on this. I'm looking at these students and I'm saying, why are we prioritizing, caregivers because that's the trade-off. This is the talent. To me, this is talent. And this is the talent that the opportunity cost is these folks we're not going to be able to attract and settle here.
So you mentioned that the points are high and they're getting frustrated. Are you seeing a lot of that because this is one of the big like you mentioned, it's all a 15,000 and caregivers who may or may not work as caregivers because all they need is a job offer. And one of the big problems with that program historically is that because it takes, you hire a caregiver when your kid's 3, and by the time the caregiver PR application is approved, the kid's 6. Do they actually need it? And will it's not clear to me what the purpose of that program is anymore. But that does that takes away from spots. And yeah, like there's disgruntlement from grads, disgruntlement from companies who want to retain people. And I think that that's like the story of the next 2 years, unless they jack immigration levels, is going to be frustration and like, I guess the economics of being unable to retain people.
You just nailed it. You just nailed it, Steve. That's what the story is. Like, if you go back and revisit this podcast in 2 years, I will bet you that that's going to be the big immigration story in the next over the next couple of years is the frustration. So my problem with I wrote a piece for CD Howe as soon as that category-based selection was announced, and the whole point of that little policy brief was this system has no transparency. It's politicized. Immigrant selection should not be something that happens at the whim of the minister of the day. It should politicians should have their hands tied. They should say, here's the objective, here's the strategy, here's what we're trying to, and just let the system do its thing in the background. And it's become completely politicized. So you have international students at our top universities who have done everything right, and have performed really well. And they go onto the CRS calculator online and they see their score is way above what the cutoff was. It was about 460. We were in a steady state for about 5 years. Every 2 weeks they were drawing candidates and the cutoff was 460. These People are well over 460, and they're incredibly frustrated. And here's the thing: I've never said this, publicly, but here's what kind of worries me: is these individuals have outside options, unlike many NPRs, lower skilled NPRs living in Canada. They have outside options. They can go to the US, their home countries, and do quite well. And as a result, there's not as much sympathy for these folks if they are frustrated and have to leave,
Yeah.
because they're going to go to the US or somewhere else. So that's not so. Whereas these lower skilled migrant workers who are represented by groups like these, there are groups representing them. They have a voice advocating for them. The computer science grad at University of Waterloo, there's no group, nobody's advocating for them. You don't hear anybody shouting about injustice on them. And I think it's because people aren't as sympathetic. And I get that. And I really do feel badly for these lower skilled migrants that are getting stuck and ending up as undocumented, like overstaying their visas and getting in this limbo. It's a broken system. It's a terrible system. But I worry that what's happening is because those folks have a voice, now the whole economic immigration system has become about it's humanitarianism. It's become a humanitarian program. The objective is to do the right thing, the ethical thing. And that sounds horrible. It's like, are you saying we shouldn't be doing the right ethical thing? No. Yeah, no, of course I think we should. But I think if, you gotta be clear. We have
Well, it's the economics, the trade-offs and consequences.
Yeah, right. There's an economic problem. We've got to say, if this is the economic problem, we can decide how big that program should be. But if that's the economic program, sometimes we have to put our bleeding hearts aside and say, okay, let's prioritize. And I'm a liberal, like, honest to God. I don't go around telling people that very much, but I'll say publicly here, like, I've never voted conservative in my life, and people think, like, my views being critical of this particular government, that I'm a conservative. Like, I'm not. I'm very much driven and motivated by how much I care about immigration in this country and how unique Canada is, that we have this incredible, historically, in this immigration system that works so well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like the analogy would just be they're blowing up a balloon on the temporary side, and eventually it's got to pop.
Right.
I mean, the
Right.
Ukraine, in theory, like, well, just don't know what they're going to, like, the work permit. I mean, and this just gives the Ukrainians are actually a great example of just the uncertainty in the system right now, because the first permits were issued in 2022, almost all of them subject to passport expiry, valid for 3 years because that was what the permits were all for. So there's no, in the government's mind, well, the permits aren't going to expire until 2025, so there's no need to address what's going on until then.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, Ukrainians now, it's the last year, and I think immigration lawyers across the country would say that they're getting flooded with questions of what's going to happen. Are they going to be able to extend? My husband can't extend his passport because the Ukrainian government now requires that all men go back who got out. And that combined with, like, there's an open work permit for anyone from Iran who's here, for anyone from Turkey who's here, for anyone from Israel who's here, which in theory, not that it would happen, but in theory, all of the Israeli citizens, not the Palestinians because they need visas, but all of the Israelis could move here and just get open work permits. And they keep announcing programs that just kind of increase the numbers without increasing the targets.
Yep. The bulge just gets bigger. Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's huge pushback on bringing in foreign workers at the same time. There's no sympathy to them. I think there's in Ontario, I can't remember which company brought in foreign workers for something to do with car manufacturing.
Yep.
And there's there's big hearings on it. And I don't know where it ends in terms of, like, it's everybody having to extend their status is a huge burden on companies and just huge uncertainty.
Mm.
And on students, I mean, I think you're obviously more familiar with the academic landscape. How are the cuts to student numbers going to impact things? Well, and actually just hard caps. And because this is what we talked about last time, that, and it's really the brunt is being felt in Ontario. I don't think any other province is facing as big caps. Different provinces are handling the cuts different. There isn't really, from the IRCC side, a desire to treat different schools differently. We talked about utility last time, and I joke that there's that one school in British Columbia that's located above a day massage parlor, and there's a Google image of the school when you go to Google Maps, some guy walking in front of the school, and I'm like, well, the utility of that school to that guy is huge because it gives him plausible deniability as to what he's leaving. So what are the impacts of this going to be? Just, especially in Ontario where you are, cuts. And I
Yeah.
think, am I wrong that in Ontario they are now like the provincial government is giving preference to public schools?
Yes, that for
Yeah.
sure has happened. So these public-private partnerships that were set up with the public community colleges, which is essentially outsourcing of their teaching of international students to downtown private campuses. Those pretty much are going to be shut down for
Yeah.
the most part. They're going to struggle to continue to exist. We got numbers this week that I saw somewhere on the allocations of the study permits in Ontario across schools, DLIs, and the government had to do that. They were told by the federal government, in my view, just kind of in political convenience, passed this down to shirk their responsibility and passed this down to the provinces, and the provinces have chosen numbers here. It looks like they're highly correlated with past study permits. So the Conestogas colleges have huge numbers, and Waterloo, who's been decreasing their international student numbers for the past few years, have very small numbers.
Why has Waterloo
Um,
been decreasing it?
that's a good question. That's
The only
not
mantra I've
deliberate.
heard is that it's not possible to function as a university anymore without increasing it.
So you certainly can. It's like revenue is price times quantity.
Yeah.
So if the percentage change in your price is bigger than the percentage decrease in your quantity, your revenue still goes up.
Yeah.
And so that's what's happening. They're increasing their prices so much. People don't realize, like a STEM student at Waterloo, or at least engineering and math faculties, which are the two biggest groups. Actually, arts is big too, but two big groups. Those international students are paying $77,000 per year.
Yeah.
Next year will be higher. So like this is huge, huge tuition fees. My basic criticism of those study permits, I think this should have been dealt with by the federal government. I don't actually think there was any need for study permit caps, but that's the route they've chosen. And now it's the classic economic problem that you have a scarce resource. Those are the cap permits. And the question is, how do you allocate them? Can you do it by a lottery, by first in the queue? How do you allocate them? And the way they've done it is just some proportional thing. It's totally economically inefficient, given if the objective is about productivity and economic growth, and it makes no sense. Like to have twice or three times as many permits at Conestoga than the University of Waterloo just really doesn't make sense. That people say, "Oh, you're a snob." I'm not a snob. That's like just basic
I'd never
economics.
even heard of Conestoga until the data showed they were the top numbered school.
Right?
And that's
Yeah.
relatively recent. They just shot up in
Yes. And that's why they've been given more, because I guess the pain of reducing these numbers is harder. Their addiction is a bit more severe.
yeah.
So weaning them off is going to be tougher. But
Have you
anyway,
had
so
like discussions with any students about whether the upcoming restrictions on who can bring their spouses would impact whether they would have come to Canada in the first place?
no, I have not had discussions with students about that. I wonder, I'd like to see the data, but my prior is these aren't huge numbers. The vast majority of certainly undergrad, but also grad students are single
Yeah.
when they come. They're not usually more at the grad level, this PhDs, but those are small numbers. That's overwhelmingly not the numbers that are driving this. But the part that, like I'll repeat, is, the cap, I think was a blunt instrument. It's like a sledgehammer to this problem. I think you've got to look at what's driving the massive inflow of NPRs,
Yeah.
international students. And like these are people making decisions about their lives, massive, big stakes decisions. and they're doing a cost benefit analysis. And a huge part of the benefit when they decide to come to Canada is PR status.
Yeah.
We underestimate like the willingness to pay for this. If we had auctions selling PR status, you can imagine the amount of revenue the Canadian government could generate. So migrants come here doing this cost benefit, and what's happened is that whole transition pathway from TR to PR, or from an NPR permit to TR to PR, has become like this lottery, and people are willing to take their chance and pay all this money. So the solution to me is not this sledgehammer; it is to increase the transparency of how you become PR, and that means returning to an express entry system that relies on a single metric, the CRS, where people can go, there's full transparency. You go onto the website, you put in your characteristics, you see what your score is, you see every month or every 2 weeks what the cutoff is, you kind of know what the odds are you're going to be, and you also learn, oh, if I'm below the bar, this is what I need to do to get above it, I need to do some more language training. That's all really good stuff. For an economist, good information is critically important for efficient systems, right? And well-functioning systems. So there's no transparency in the system anymore. And
the changes impact people who are already here.
Yeah,
which is part of where
the work
huge
rights.
frustration is.
Yeah, the work rights I really had trouble with from the beginning. I think that's a big
work
problem.
rights?
The allowing off-campus unlimited hours of on-campus work for the international students. I think that also served to lure huge numbers of international students.
Well, there were huge videos on TikTok and Twitter of just huge lineups of people looking for work, which is it's a mess. I'm really I have no idea where this is gonna lead, because there's the pressure of all the frustrated employers and immigrants against what seems the political necessity of getting numbers down. So I don't know what trade-off they'll make. The other one I've got all these access to information requests in terms of trade-offs, was the government's decision in 2022 or 3 to have that public policy to bulk approve pending TRV applications that have now resulted in tens of thousands of refugee claims. And it would be so neat to see the trade-offs of, like, they had the choice of canceling those applications, which I guess refunding $100 a person, or approving them all and then being, having all the refugee claims. And I think I would have done, I'm just really curious to see, when they're doing these decisions, what went into the thought process. I don't know if you've seen any insight. Is it just like, I don't know. It's there have been decisions made where after they almost see, oh, whoops, didn't see that coming.
Yeah. I've become more and more cynical over the years, unfortunately, about how these decisions are made and how much of it is lobbying. There are some really influential organizations out there that have very loud, powerful voices and lots of money behind them, and they for sure are influential. I am occasionally asked to participate in a meeting, an IRCC policy meeting, consulting kind of meeting. And there you sort of get that feeling, how much of it is driven by, like I was in the most recent one I was part of was actually a general discussion about really interesting questions. So you want to transition lower skilled candidates in the NPR pool to PR. The problem is, how do you discriminate between them? You have to prioritize in some kind of dimension, or you just do a lottery, but they don't want to do that. So you got to prioritize somehow. So what attribute or criterion do you prioritize on? And because they're all low skilled, right? So you can't prioritize on skill because they're all equally low skilled. And so the main recommendation, which I was quite strongly opposed to and still am, is to prioritize give preference to the people who've been here the longest. And I think that just completely creates bad incentives. That does not create good incentives for migrants.
I've got
yeah.
People at the firm will laugh, like, because I bring this up at least once a week when people start talking about how ridiculous things are. And I say, we have a program for out of status construction workers in the Greater
Right.
Toronto area, but not one for in status construction workers. Like, it's just, ay, ay,
So
ay,
you,
ay,
you
ay.
you and I are on the same wavelength, Steve.
Yeah, it's well, and the other one, like in the terms of the discussion about regularizing the status of everyone who's here, um, and some people, I think Matthew Awama on Twitter has talked about this, is like there is a humanitarian and compassionate program that in theory should capture the humanitarian and compassionate cases amongst the people who've been here a long time. And the minister hasn't really addressed why that's not sufficient. Um, which I don't, I mean, I can hear immigration lawyers giving like, and I know that that program has issues, but like there is a pathway in theory for the humanitarian and compassionate cases, which is the whole idea behind regularizing status. Um, do you think that that the driving up of temporary numbers to create all this tension is designed to just make it politically necessary to increase permanent levels, or is it just a series of unintended consequences?
Yeah, I really, really do not believe that the Liberal government intended for the NPR population to increase in the way it has.
That's
Uh,
like, yeah. I mean, they've kind of just done where they set up programs that I guess they don't impose caps on.
that's it.
Ukraine. I think that by the time they realized how many students were coming in 2023 and just the way the bureaucracy works, that by the time they realized what was going on, it was too late to stop it.
Yeah. But
Um,
as I keep iterating, like their role in this is they changed the rules on the PR side. And that made it a lot easier for the people who are recruiting these international students to sell them
yeah,
on taking up study permits and paying these very high tuition fees. So, the Liberal Party certainly had a role in this, but they didn't see it. You know, Steve, as you probably know, for a data guy on immigration, the TR, as they call it, they don't call it NPR at IRCC. They always called it TR, temporary residency,
yeah.
and PR. Those were completely different shops at IRCC. They didn't connect. In fact, the whole database structure until 2014 never connect. There was no connection. Once in a while, in the facts and figures publications every year, there would be one table in there that would talk about the transitions. But for the most part, these were independent populations, and all of that. And so we moved to this two-step system. But the policymakers kept thinking in a world in which these are independent groups, and they're still. That is part of the ministers. I've heard Mark Miller use this talking point. I've heard Sean Fraser use the talking point that what happened on the TR side is totally, we didn't intend for that to happen. It has nothing to do with what's happening on the PR side. But that's not true. These things are very much connected. You make changes on the PR side about who gets in, that's going to affect the inflow of the demand for permanence on the NPR side. Yeah.
No, it's very like, do you find when you're trying to do research that there's certain, either through the way things are defined or name changes, that it's hard to get a picture of what's going on? I'll give you an example, which is in 2014, the Conservatives took the temporary foreign worker program and split it in half into the temporary
Yep.
foreign worker program and the international mobility program. And the result was that the temporary foreign worker program shrank, right? Because they were just half the people were in the international mobility program. And you'll see in discussions on this, both in the media and on Reddit, people talking, well, look, the number of foreign workers fell in the from 2014 to 2020 before it rebounded. And you're just, as someone familiar with what they did, you're like, no, and I think that actually was the intention when they did it in part. Do you find that comes up a lot as you're trying to figure out what's going on, that the way terms are defined and programs named?
Yeah. So I wrote a paper about this, about that separation that Jason Kenney did with the TFWP
Yeah.
into the IMP, and trying to see like how much of this are actually the same types of work, migrants coming, and they're just being relabeled? I mean, officially, it's whether you require an LMIA, but how much of it is just, okay, they don't require an LMIA. We'll just push them over there under the carpet in the IMP thing, and it's not going to be as transparent because we don't call that temporary foreign workers. So the whole point of this paper I wrote is to say, okay, let's be honest here. There are de facto temporary, de jure, sure, but de facto there are temporary foreign workers, and the international students are increasingly in that group too, right? Like that when
Yeah.
they're coming here and they're working full time, they're de facto they're temporary foreign workers. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, here I'll probably ruffle the feathers of some of your immigration lawyer listeners and consultants. Um, if I have one pet peeve or frustration with that sort of sector, and where I have stabbed a little bit and had blowback, is as an economist, I think a lot about incentives, and it seems to me that if I'm an immigration lawyer consultant, the incentive, there's an incentive for me to advocate for more complexity. There's an incentive for me to advocate for complexity that candidates for immigration can't navigate the system on their own without the help of a consultant or lawyer. And I worry, I mean, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I do worry sometimes. The system, without question, has become more complicated over time, become less possible for migrants to navigate. And I don't see it becoming any simpler. And I think it's unnecessarily complicated. There's just far too many different names and programs and streams, and there's hundreds of thousands of these things, I believe, right?
Oh,
It's just crazy.
yeah. I mean, there's definitely a mix of like lobbying that goes on. Some of it I think is also just unintended, like the demand
Yes.
for faster processing times leads to this regime of, okay, well, if an application is incomplete, then it's bounced, which makes things unbelievably complicated. But then technically someone doesn't apply until it's complete. It's just another way that I find that the statistics are, because like the basic concept is um, IRCC count. Like if someone applies January 1, but they're missing a document and March 1, it's returned to them. So they apply again April, and let's say it's returned again because this time a signature is missing. They
Mm-hmm.
apply again June 1 and it's accepted into processing, and July 1, the application is approved. Officially, that's 1 month processing when really the person is interacting with the system for 7 months. But it's not recorded as
I
like
see.
it's only a 1 month processing.
Oh, wow. I didn't know
And
that.
yeah, and the one that really, and I still don't know if it's deliberate or not. And I've actually raised it in legal arguments and stuff and certain judicial reviews, was during COVID, they would keep representing before Parliament that they weren't returning applications that were incomplete. And they would represent this to this House of Commons Committee on Immigration. And I would tweet this, and all these lawyers would say, "What? Yes, they are. Yes, they are." And someone made the point of saying, well, technically, there is no application until it's complete. So technically, they aren't actually like misrepresenting because, but that's an example of just how these terms
Yeah, right.
can totally. Same thing how Francophone migration got redefined in 2023, where for a Francophone work permit, you had to have CLB 7, so you had to be fluent across speaking, listening, reading, writing. And then in 2023, they changed it to you have to have intermediate speaking and listening in French. And so their Francophone work permit program grew, but were they all Francophones? Which now actually, and you can say, is there any economic benefit to all the immigration lawyers and consultants having to tell people, go learn French to get to
Yeah.
CLB 5 in speaking and listening only? Like, is that just, I don't know, it's just a quirk
Hmm.
in the system right now that I imagine has no real economic benefit of spending time on Duolingo.
Mm.
One question that we got just looking at the time is going back to the parent and grandparent program and whether there are studies on, I guess some people criticize it as substituting for the government providing childcare. Others say there is a dollar value that can be provided. I would say that it is their utility. This just continues to be a concept that seems to justify anything. But so are there studies that talk about the economic impacts of the parent and grandparent program?
So, in terms of the theory of what that mechanism might look like, in which having a parent in Canada can have an economic benefit, I think the mechanism looks something like this. You have a parent, it's usually a woman, because women are more likely to take on those child caring responsibilities, are more likely to be constrained by them in terms of their labor supply. And so the idea is that it's difficult to find formal daycare in Canada. We know that market has all kinds of problems. And so some professional with very high human capital, usually a woman, is unable to utilize that human capital, is can't work as many hours, maybe only can work part-time or maybe not at all. And so there's inefficiency of allocation of tasks. This person's not focused on the tasks that produce the most value for the economy. Having a parent here, on the other hand, their comparative advantage is taking care of a child. Having your grandma or grandpa take care of you can be a pretty good
Yeah.
outcome for a child. And so that's kind of the story. There clearly is, in theory, a mechanism through which providing that care. Okay, so then you want to go to the empirics. What's the magnitude of this? Like, how constrained are the cap? Like, we certainly have reduced family reunification. Can we quantify what the cost of that has been to this kind of a situation where people aren't fully utilizing your human capital because they have to take care of kids? Okay, so that's hard. That's really hard. To
Yeah.
identify that thing is tough. And I'll tell you why, in huge part, why it's tough compared to doing other kind of economic analysis of immigration, is that the caring activity of the parent is not observed in any of the data. Like, you just
Yeah.
don't see that. So, like, you'd like to go to something like the labor force survey, which is where we measure the labor market activity, but this is mostly unpaid work. So these people are not going to declare in the labor force survey that they're employed. These are not, like official. This is informal kinds of arrangements within families. It's not a paid employment, and there's no kind of tax data. They're not paying taxes, so you don't see it in the tax data. There's no data. It's very invisible. And so trying to quantify that is required. So I've reviewed a paper recently of course, won't say what journal. These are anonymous peer reviews. I loved the question. I loved it was really set up well. And I was like, oh my God, we're actually going to get some hard evidence on how big this benefit might be. And then, of course, through no fault of the authors, it just wasn't credible what they tried to do with the data. I didn't buy it. And so, I continue to hold my breath, waiting for that day that somebody might figure out a credible way to identify this. I think in theory it's there, but how big it is, I'm agnostic. I really don't know.
Yeah. On the peer review, when StatsCan produces reports, are those peer reviewed?
I do review some of those. I
Okay.
think yes, that they are.
So it wouldn't be like right of me to, whenever I read StatsCan, to wonder if it's just government spin, like it's separate, the StatsCan.
Oh
There's
no,
not.
I think definitely, well, maybe I'm biased. I used to work at Statistics Canada.
Okay, I didn't know
Um,
that.
I certainly never felt. Oh, so okay, I got to be a little careful on this. I did have at least one experience. I'm an open book. As my wife says, I got pockets. My mouth is like a ripped pocket. Everything just kind of falls out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, for the most part, I have never felt that. Having said that, just full transparency, I did write a paper on immigration that was a little bit controversial in 2004. And before we released it, there was a request from what was then CIC to discuss it with us. And when we
Yeah.
sat down with them, they clearly wanted to massage some of the messaging. And I didn't take to that very well, and we released it without making those changes.
Okay.
So that I think that's the extent. I mean, from my experience, that's the extent to which that might happen. There may be a request from a department to say, "Can we at least have a discussion with this before you guys put this out?" But I mean, of course, StatsCan is in principle arm's length from the government, as it absolutely should be.
Yeah, yeah,
This
no,
is
I've
where,
just
yeah.
I've wondered on the when I'm reading things, is this spin? What am I reading?
No,
Um,
I hope it's not. Then we have a big problem. Then we
yeah.
have a big problem.
No, this and once again, I haven't kept it to 30 minutes, but this has been fun. We'll see in 2 years. I think it will be the booming frustration when we speak next. Will be, I have no idea actually
Yeah,
what they're going to do,
me
or the next
neither.
government, because it is noticeable that all the planning goes till just after, in theory, the next election.
Right.
So
Yeah.
going to be interesting.
It will be. And thanks a lot, Steve. I really appreciate this. I always enjoy this. And
Yeah,
I should say, I'm not only have not only been on here now twice, I listen too. And big kudos to those sessions you had where you talked to the ministers.
yeah, those were
I
fun.
listened to all of those. Those were absolutely fantastic. So if you can get,
Yeah.
I think the most recent one you maybe had was John McCallum, who I kind of know. He's an
No,
economist.
Sergio, I think Sergio Marchi came after
Oh,
McCallum.
did you?
Or was
Okay.
Chris Alexander after McCallum? I can't
But
remember.
he was before McCallum, wasn't he?
Oh, just
Chris
in
Alex.
order of podcast. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, I see.
the
Yeah,
most
right.
recent minister was John McCallum.
Right. That's what the
Um,
way I was thinking about the most recent minister.
yeah.
So yeah, if you could update that, I will definitely be
Yeah,
tuning
yeah.
into
We'll
those.
reach out. It's hard to get current politicians, but
Sure, sure.
we definitely will be reaching out.
Awesome.